Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most famous travelers in history, the man who supposedly saw everything, wrote it all down, and may or may not have exaggerated just a tiny bit, Marco Polo. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Because somewhere out there, someone is listening to this while questioning whether medieval travel blogs were just as unreliable as modern ones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's confirm something right away. Because if you clicked this video, you're wondering one thing. Did Marco Polo lie about everything? Short answer, no. Long answer, no. But he definitely understood the assignment when it came to making things sound impressive. Picture this. You're a merchant from Venice, a city where people don't just trade goods, they trade stories. Ships arrive daily carrying silk, spices, and at least 3 exaggerated tales per sailor. By the time you're a teenager, you already know that the further away a place is, the less anyone can fact-check you. Convenient. Now, according to Marco, he didn't just hear about the East. He went there. As a teenager, casually, like a gap year but with more desserts and fewer life choices. He claims he travelled across mountains, crossed endless deserts, and eventually arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, one of the most powerful rulers on Earth. And not just visited, stayed, worked, got sent on missions. Basically, Marco Polo's version of events has him functioning somewhere between trusted advisor and guy who just showed up but is very confident. Now, already this sounds impressive. Suspiciously impressive. Because here's the part where things start to wobble slightly. Like a table with one uneven leg. Marco didn't write any of this down while it was happening. Instead, years later, while sitting in a prison cell in Genoa, he decided it was the perfect time to finally tell his story. And the man writing it for him? Rustichello da Pisa. A professional storyteller whose main job was basically turning normal events into something that sounds like it deserves dramatic background music. So what we have here is not a diary, not notes, not even a careful historical account. It's a collaboration between a traveller with a very good memory for interesting details and a writer with absolutely no incentive to make things less exciting. What could possibly go wrong? And this is where things get beautifully suspicious. Because Marco's book doesn't sound like someone cautiously reporting facts. It sounds like someone who knows you're about to fall asleep and is trying to keep you awake. Wait, it gets better. Then the city was even bigger. And then there was more gold. At some point, you're not sure if you're reading history or the medieval version of "Trust me, bro." But here's the problem. Some of what he says is actually correct. Shockingly correct. Which means you can't just dismiss him. You're stuck in this uncomfortable position where you're thinking, this sounds fake, but also weirdly accurate. And that's the genius of it. Marco Polo didn't just tell a story, he told it in a way that makes you question it, while still wanting to believe every word. Which, if we're being honest, is exactly what the best storytellers, and the most suspicious ones, tend to do. So now you have the setup. A well-travelled merchant, or at least a very confident one, sitting in a prison cell in Genoa with nothing but time, and an audience of exactly one. And not just any audience, a writer, which is either very lucky or very dangerous. Because the man listening to Marco Polo wasn't some bored guard half paying attention. It was Rustichello da Pisa, a guy whose entire career revolved around taking stories and making them more dramatic than they probably needed to be. So imagine the situation. You're Marco. You've got years of travel memories, some clear, some blurry, some probably mixed together like a medieval version of, wait, was that this city or the other one? And across from you is a professional storyteller thinking, this is good, but what if we made it better? Now add one more ingredient, prison boredom. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, that improves storytelling confidence like being stuck in a room with no distractions and someone willing to listen. Details become sharper, distances become longer, cities become bigger, and suddenly every minor inconvenience becomes a life-threatening ordeal. Because why not? It's not like anyone in Europe can just hop on a horse and go fact-check you. And this is where the tone of the travels really takes shape. It doesn't read like someone carefully documenting reality. It reads like someone remembering and performing. Then we crossed a desert. Okay. Then we crossed the greatest desert anyone has ever seen. There it is. Also, there were probably dangers. Many dangers. Trust me. Now, to be fair, Marco wasn't necessarily lying. He was doing something much more human. He was reconstructing his life into a story that made sense, flowed well, and, most importantly, kept his only listener interested. And Rusticello? He wasn't fact-checking. He was polishing, adding rhythm, structure, drama, turning a long journey into something that felt almost mythical. Which means what we end up with isn't a record. It's a performance captured on paper, and once you realise that, everything starts to make a lot more sense. Because the question isn't just, did Marco Polo lie? It's also, was he telling the truth or telling the best version of it? Now here's where things get annoying. Because just when you're ready to dismiss Marco Polo as the medieval CEO of exaggeration, parts of his story start checking out. And not in a vague, yeah, that sounds possible way, in a very specific, how did he know that, kind of way. According to Marco, he and his family travelled east along routes we now call the Silk Road, a network of trade paths stretching across Asia, connecting Europe to China long before GPS or even decent road signs existed. This wasn't a casual trip. This was months, years, of moving through deserts, mountains, and regions where one wrong decision meant you simply didn't come back. And here's the thing, we know these routes existed. We know merchants used them. We know goods, ideas, and people moved back and forth constantly. So Marco travelling east, completely believable, annoyingly believable. He describes vast deserts where travellers carried water carefully, where caravans stuck together for survival, and where losing your way wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. That checks out. He talks about strange new goods, unfamiliar customs, and massive distances that made Europe feel small by comparison. Also checks out, so now you're in a weird position. Because the foundation of his story is solid, which means if he is exaggerating, he's doing it on top of something real, and that's much harder to dismiss. Then of course comes the biggest claim, that he eventually reached the court of Kublai Khan, ruler of an empire so vast it made every European kingdom look like a medium-sized inconvenience. Marco describes the Mongol world as organised, efficient and powerful in ways Europeans had never imagined. Road systems, communication networks, trade routes protected by the state. It almost sounds modern. And again, here's the problem. He's not wrong. The Mongol Empire really did create one of the most connected systems of trade and communication the world had ever seen. So now you're stuck. Because this isn't the story of a man inventing nonsense. This is the story of a man who clearly knew things, mixed with moments that feel just a little too perfect. And that's where the doubt creeps in. Not because everything is false, but because just enough of it is true to make the rest harder to question. So by now you're starting to accept something uncomfortable. Marco Polo probably did travel east. He probably saw things most Europeans could only dream about. And he probably experienced a world far more advanced than anything back home. But then, he keeps talking. And this is where things go from impressive traveller to main character energy. According to Marco, he didn't just arrive at the court of Kublai Khan. He became useful, important, trusted. He claims the Khan liked him so much that he was sent on official missions across the empire, travelling to distant regions, observing local customs, and reporting back like some kind of medieval field agent, which sounds incredible. Also, slightly convenient, because suddenly, Marco isn't just a visitor anymore. He's everywhere. Every region he describes, he's been there. Every custom he explains, he saw it firsthand. Every detail, verified personally, of course. It's a very efficient way to establish credibility. Almost too efficient. Now here's the issue. The Mongol Empire, especially under Kublai Khan, was extremely well organised. They kept records. Lots of them. Names, officials, envoys. The kind of paperwork that makes modern bureaucracy look relaxed. And in all of that, no mention of Marco Polo. Not one. No trusted Venetian advisor. No young foreign envoy doing important missions. Nothing. Which creates a slightly awkward situation. Because either Marco Polo was somehow so important that he travelled across the empire, but also so unimportant that no one bothered writing his name down, or He wasn't quite as central as he makes himself sound. Now, to be fair, there's a middle ground here. It's entirely possible Marco was present at the court. Maybe he worked in some minor role. Maybe he travelled a bit. But when he tells the story later, those roles become upgraded. A small task becomes an official mission. A brief visit becomes extended service. A conversation becomes influence. Because let's be honest, if you're telling your life story years later, you're not going to say, yeah, I was kind of just there. No, you're going to say, I was trusted by the most powerful man in the world. And technically, no one in Europe could prove otherwise. Which makes it a very safe claim. And a very effective one. Because by the time you finish reading his account, you're no longer picturing a merchant observing events. You're picturing a man at the centre of them. And that shift? That's not an accident. That's storytelling. By this point, you're starting to get used to Marco Polo being selective, very observant when it helps his story, mysteriously blind when it doesn't. And this is where historians start leaning forward, narrowing their eyes and quietly saying, okay, but how did you miss that? Because Marco Polo describes a lot. Cities, markets, wealth, systems of government, all in impressive detail. He talks about paper money like it's the most normal thing in the world, describes trade routes, and even explains how the Mongol Empire functioned with surprising accuracy. And then he skips things that feel impossible to ignore. Let's start with the obvious one, the Great Wall of China. Now yes, the wall we see today was expanded later, but fortifications and large defensive structures absolutely existed during his time. Not small ones either. Big, visible. You would probably mention this kind of structures. Marco says nothing. Not a sentence. Not even a casual, by the way, there's a massive wall. Which is interesting. Then there's tea. China had been drinking tea for centuries. It wasn't rare. It wasn't hidden. It was everywhere. Marco, not impressed apparently, doesn't mention it at all. Which is a bit like someone visiting Italy and writing a whole book about it without ever mentioning pasta, coffee, or people arguing loudly in the street. Technically possible. Emotionally suspicious. Then there are chopsticks. Again, widely used, culturally significant, and very noticeable if you've never seen them before. Marco describes food, just not how people eat it, which feels like an odd thing to overlook. And it doesn't stop there. Foot binding, a major cultural practice at the time, not mentioned. Common daily customs that would seem strange to a European, mostly missing. It's like Marco zooms in on grand, impressive details and completely ignores the everyday realities, which raises a very uncomfortable possibility. What if Marco didn't spend as much time observing daily life as he claims? Or worse, what if some of his information didn't come from direct experience at all? Because here's the pattern. He's incredibly detailed when talking about big, impressive systems, and strangely vague, or silent, when it comes to normal, lived reality, almost like someone describing a place they understand broadly, but haven't fully experienced up close. And once you notice that pattern, it's very hard to unsee it, and just when you're ready to completely side-eye Marco Polo and mentally label him professional exaggerator with confidence, he does something very inconvenient. He's right. Not vaguely right, not accidentally right, very specifically, annoyingly right. Take paper money. When Marco describes it, he talks about a system where the government prints notes, people trust them, and they're used in everyday transactions instead of gold or silver. Now imagine hearing that in medieval Europe. You'd immediately assume this man had finally lost it. Paper is money? Sure. And next, you're going to tell me people carry tiny glowing boxes that show them maps and arguments. But here's the problem. In Yuan China, under Kublai Khan, paper currency was very real. It was organized, state-controlled, and widely used. Marco didn't invent that. He described it accurately. Then there's coal. Marco mentions a black stone that burns better than wood and is used for fuel. Again, sounds strange to Europeans at the time. Also completely true. Coal was already in use in parts of China, and it would later become essential in Europe centuries down the line. So now you're dealing with a man who gets major, specific details correct, in a way that's hard to fake. And it doesn't stop there. He describes massive cities. Cities so large that Europeans reading his book probably assumed he had added an extra zero by accident. but archaeological evidence suggests that cities like Hangzhou were indeed enormous, far beyond anything in Europe at the time. So once again, Marco sounds unbelievable, and then turns out to be right, which creates a very frustrating situation for historians. Because if he were completely wrong, it would be easy. You'd just dismiss everything. But he's not. He's selectively accurate, which is much more dangerous, because now you can't tell where the line is. You can't say, this is all fiction. Instead, you're stuck asking, which parts are true, and which parts just sound true? And that's where Marco Polo becomes less of a traveller, and more of a puzzle, because the more you fact-check him, the more you realise something unsettling. He knew enough to be believable, and just enough to keep you guessing, so now you're dealing with a very specific kind of problem. Marco Polo clearly knew things. He described systems, technologies, and cities that actually existed. He wasn't just making everything up. But at the same time, he also describes places and events in a way that feels just a little too convenient, a little too complete, a little too everywhere. Because here's the strange part. Marco writes as if he personally witnessed almost everything he describes. Remote provinces, he's been there. Unusual customs, seen them. Distant cities, visited personally, of course. At some point you start to wonder, did this man ever sit still? Or was he just teleporting across Asia with a notebook? And this is where historians introduce a much more realistic theory. Marco didn't see everything himself. He collected stories. Think about it. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route for goods. It was a highway for information. Merchants, travellers, officials and locals were constantly exchanging stories about distant lands. What's that city like? Oh, it's huge. Rich. Full of wonders. Noted. I'll remember that. Over time, these stories blend together. And if you're Marco, years later in a prison cell trying to reconstruct your journey, those stories might start to feel like your own experiences. Not because you're lying, but because your memory has improved the narrative. And let's be honest, if you heard about an incredible city from 3 different merchants, all describing it in detail, you could probably describe it pretty convincingly yourself, especially if no one reading your book has ever been there, which is exactly Marco's situation. So what you get is a fascinating mix, some first-hand observation, some second-hand information, all presented with the same level of confidence, no footnotes. No, I heard this from a guy, just, this is how it is. And honestly, you kind of have to respect the confidence, because it works. As a reader, you don't stop and think, wait, did he actually see this? You just keep going. You accept it. Because everything is delivered in the same calm, detailed tone, which blurs the line completely. And that's the key. Marco Polo didn't need to lie about everything. He just needed to tell everything the same way. And suddenly, it all feels equally real, even when it probably wasn't. By now, you're probably thinking, okay, so Marco Polo didn't lie exactly. He just enhanced reality. And honestly, that might be the most accurate way to describe it. Because here's something important to understand. Medieval people did not tell stories the way we do today. Accuracy was nice. Impression was better. If your story didn't amaze people, confuse them slightly, and leave them questioning their entire worldview, then what was even the point? So when Marco describes cities with endless wealth, markets overflowing with goods, and systems that seemed almost futuristic compared to Europe, he might not be inventing them. He might just be adjusting the volume, turning everything up. A big city becomes the biggest city anyone has ever seen. A rich market becomes unbelievably rich. A powerful ruler becomes almost mythical. Because subtlety? Not really in style. And remember, his audience back in Europe had never seen any of this. They had no frame of reference. If Marco said a city was 10 times bigger than anything they knew, they couldn't exactly pull out a map and argue. They just had to sit there and think, well, I guess that's possible. Which gives Marco a huge advantage. Because exaggeration becomes almost impossible to detect. Now add one more layer. Marco isn't just describing places. He's competing for attention. His book isn't the only story circulating in Europe. There are other travellers, other rumours, other exaggerated accounts. So if you want people to remember your story, you make it stand out. You make it bigger, more detailed, more impressive, and maybe, just maybe, a little more dramatic than it needs to be. It's not lying. It's Marketing. Very early marketing. And when you look at it that way, Marco Polo starts to make a lot more sense. He wasn't trying to write a modern history book. He was trying to tell a story that people would actually listen to, and he succeeded. Because centuries later, we're still talking about it, still questioning it, still wondering what was real and what wasn't. Which means whatever he did, it worked, almost too well. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, but why didn't people just question Marco Polo more? Fair question, logical question, completely modern question. Because medieval Europe wasn't exactly running peer-reviewed fact-checking committees. It was running on curiosity and imagination. And Marco Polo arrived at the perfect time. Europe knew very little about the East. Asia was this distant, mysterious place. Rich, powerful, and just out of reach. People had heard stories, of course. Traders talked. Rumors spread, but nothing felt complete. Then suddenly along comes Marco with a full narrative, not fragments, not vague rumors, a full detailed account of lands, cities, rulers, and systems. And here's the key. It sounded believable enough. Not realistic enough to be boring, not absurd enough to be dismissed. Right in that sweet spot. Because if Marco had said, yeah, it's basically the same as Europe, nobody would care. And if he had said, there are flying dragons handing out gold coins, people would have closed the book immediately. Instead, he gives them something in between. Strange, but structured. Different, but logical. And most importantly, useful. Because merchants saw opportunity, rulers saw potential alliances, explorers saw destinations. Marco's story wasn't just entertainment, it was information. Possibly exaggerated information, but still information, and people wanted it to be true. That's the part we often forget. They weren't sitting there trying to debunk him. They were hoping he was right. Because if even half of what he described was real, that meant there was an entire world out there waiting to be reached. A world richer, bigger, and more advanced than anything they had ever known. And that idea? That's powerful. Powerful enough to override skepticism. Powerful enough to make people accept details they might otherwise question. Because belief, when it's convenient, is very easy. And Marco Polo, whether intentionally or not, gave Europe exactly what it wanted. A story that felt like discovery. Even if parts of it were still just out of reach of the truth. And once people believe something like that, it becomes very hard to take it away. By now you might be starting to respect Marco Polo, or at least respect his confidence. Because telling stories this bold, this detailed, and this hard to verify takes a certain kind of personality. But back home in Venice, not everyone was fully convinced. In fact, they gave him a nickname, Il Milione, which sounds impressive, until you realize it roughly translates to something like the man of a million exaggerations, or depending on how charitable you're feeling, the man of a million stories. Which is a very polite way of saying, we're not entirely sure about this guy. And honestly, that nickname tells you everything you need to know about how people saw him. Because here's the thing, Marco didn't return quietly. He came back with stories, big ones, cities beyond imagination, wealth beyond belief, a ruler more powerful than any king Europe had ever known. And when you say things like that in a place where most people haven't travelled further than a few hundred kilometres, you're going to get reactions. Some people were fascinated, others were sceptical, and some probably just nodded politely while thinking, yeah, sure you did, but Marco didn't back down. He didn't soften his claims. He didn't say, well, maybe I misremembered a few things. No, he doubled down. Because once you've told a story that big, there's really no going halfway. You either commit, or you admit you might have exaggerated, and admitting that, not exactly great for your reputation. So Marco stuck to his version, and over time, that version became the version. Even the nickname Il Milione didn't really hurt him. If anything, it made him more memorable. Because now he wasn't just Marco Polo. He was Marco Polo, the guy with unbelievable stories. Which, ironically, made people even more curious. Because whether they believed him or not, they wanted to hear what he would say next. And that's the strange part. Being doubted didn't weaken his story. It strengthened it. Because the more outrageous it sounded, the more people talked about it. And the more they talked about it, the more it spread, which means that nickname, it wasn't just a joke. It was branding. And very effective branding at that. So at this point, you might be thinking, all right, exaggerated, maybe unreliable, occasionally suspicious. But still just a story, right? Not exactly. Because the travels of Marco Polo didn't just entertain people, it influenced them a lot. And this is where things go from mildly questionable storytelling to historically significant consequences. Because once Marco's book started circulating across Europe, it became something more than a story. It became a guide. Not an accurate one, necessarily, but a compelling one. Merchants read it and thought, there's wealth out there. Real wealth. Rulers read it and thought, there are powerful empires we know nothing about. And explorers? They read it and thought, I want to see this for myself. Which brings us to one very important reader, Christopher Columbus. Yes, that one. Columbus owned a copy of Marco Polo's book. Not only that, he annotated it, took notes, treated it seriously, which is slightly terrifying if you think about it. Because this means that one of the most famous voyages in history was, at least in part, inspired by a book that may or may not have been creatively enhanced. Columbus wasn't just sailing randomly. He was trying to reach the lands Marco Polo described. The wealth, the cities, the empire of Kublai Khan. He expected to find them. He just took a very wrong turn, which is one way to accidentally discover an entirely different continent. But here's the important part. Even if Marco exaggerated, even if parts of his story were secondhand or slightly dramatized, the core idea was powerful enough to push people into action. It made distant lands feel real, reachable, worth pursuing, and that's something Europe didn't really have before. Marco didn't just describe the East, he made it feel possible. And once something feels possible, people start moving. Ships are built, routes are planned, risks are taken. So whether Marco Polo was entirely truthful or not almost becomes irrelevant at this point, because the effect of his story was real, very real. His book didn't just survive, it changed the way people thought about the world. And in doing so, it quietly helped reshape it. By now, you've probably accepted something uncomfortable about Marco Polo. He wasn't a liar in the simple sense. He was something much harder to deal with. Someone who told the truth, but arranged it very carefully. Because when you look at the travels, it's not random chaos. It's structured, smooth, convincing, almost too convincing. And that's usually a sign that what you're reading isn't raw memory, it's edited memory. Think about how people tell stories today. You don't include every detail. You don't mention every boring moment. You highlight what matters. You connect events in a way that makes sense. And sometimes, you improve the pacing. Maybe you combine two events into one. Maybe you move something slightly out of order. Maybe you emphasize the most impressive version of what happened. Not because you're trying to deceive, but because you're trying to tell a good story. Now take that instinct and remove any possibility of fact-checking. That's Marco Polo's situation. Years after his journey, sitting in a prison cell, reconstructing decades of experience, some first-hand, some second-hand, into a single narrative. Of course it's going to be polished. Of course it's going to feel cleaner than real life. Real life is messy. Stories aren't. And Marco's story, very clean, almost suspiciously clean. Every place flows into the next. Every description feels intentional. Every detail seems selected for maximum impact, which is great for storytelling, but slightly concerning for accuracy, because when everything fits perfectly, it usually means something has been adjusted. And here's the key point. Marco didn't need to invent entire cities or cultures. Those already existed. All he had to do was present them in a way that felt bigger, smoother, more extraordinary. And suddenly, reality becomes something else, not false, just upgraded. And that's why historians struggle with him, because you can't just say, this is wrong. Instead, you have to say, this is probably true, but told in a way that makes it feel even more true than it actually was. Which is much harder to untangle, because once truth and storytelling are blended like that, they stop being separate things. They become the same narrative. And at that point, you're not just reading history anymore. You're reading history, rewritten to be unforgettable. Now let's talk about something even less reliable than medieval storytelling, human memory. Because by the time Marco Polo sat down in that prison cell in Genoa to tell his story, years had passed. Not days, not weeks, years. And memory doesn't just sit there, patiently preserving every detail like a perfectly organized archive. It changes, constantly. Details fade, moments blur together. Distances stretch, and sometimes things improve, not intentionally, just naturally, because the brain isn't designed to store facts, it's designed to store meaning. So when Marco remembers a journey across a desert, he might not recall every step, every stop, every exact location. What he remembers is the feeling, the heat, the danger, the scale. And when he tells that story later, those feelings take priority over precise details, which is how a long journey becomes an epic one. Not because it didn't happen, but because it felt that way. Now add repetition. If Marco told his story multiple times before it was written down, to friends, family, other merchants, each retelling likely refined it, smoothed it, made it more engaging, because that's what happens when stories are told out loud. You notice what gets reactions, you keep those parts, you drop the boring bits, and over time the story becomes optimized, more dramatic, more coherent, more memorable, and slightly further from the original experience. Again, not because of deception, but because of how storytelling works. Now add one final layer, the audience. Marco isn't telling his story to people who have been to Asia, he's telling it to people who haven't, which means there's no one in the room saying, wait, that's not exactly how that works. There's no correction, no pushback, just curiosity, and maybe a bit of disbelief, but not enough to stop the story. So what you end up with is something fascinating, a narrative shaped by memory, refined by repetition, and delivered to an audience that can't fully challenge it. Which means the story we have today isn't just what Marco experienced, it's what Marco remembered, after years of thinking about it, telling it, and improving it. And that's a very different thing, because memory doesn't lie. But it does edit. So now we arrive at the question that refuses to go away, not the small details, not the exaggerations, the big one. Did Marco Polo actually make it all the way to China? Because everything we've talked about so far, the missing details, the exaggerated roles, the second-hand stories, all lead here. And unfortunately, there is no simple answer. Some historians say yes. They argue that Marco's knowledge of certain systems, like paper money, trade networks, and administrative structures under Kublai Khan, is too specific to be entirely second-hand. These weren't common facts in Europe. They weren't widely understood, and yet Marco describes them with confidence. That suggests exposure, real exposure. But then the doubts come back. No Chinese records mention him. No official documents place him at court. And for a system as organized as the Mongol administration, that absence is noticeable. Not definitive, but noticeable. So another theory appears. Maybe Marco did travel east. Maybe he reached parts of Central Asia, or even the edges of China. But maybe he didn't go as far as he claims, or didn't stay as long, or wasn't as involved as he suggests. In this version, Marco becomes something slightly different. Not a fraud, not a liar, but a traveller who saw enough to understand the world he was describing, and then filled in the gaps. Because once you have a general picture, it's surprisingly easy to complete it, especially when your audience has no way of checking. And let's be honest, if Marco had come back and said, yeah, I got pretty far, saw some interesting things, but didn't make it all the way, that's not exactly a bestseller. That's not a story people repeat for centuries. So instead, we get the full version, the complete journey, the perfect arc, and maybe, just maybe, a few extra miles added along the way. But here's the part that makes this question so frustrating. Even if Marco didn't go exactly where he said he did, his story still reflects a real world, a real empire, real systems. So you can't dismiss him. You can only adjust him, which leaves us in an awkward but honest position. Marco Polo may not have been exactly where he claimed, but he was close enough to convince generations that he had. And sometimes, that's all it takes. So after all of this, the prison storytelling, the missing details, the surprisingly accurate descriptions, and the slightly suspicious confidence, we're left with one final question. What do we actually do with Marco Polo? Do we call him a liar? Do we call him a genius? Or do we accept something far less satisfying? That he was both, depending on the moment. Because here's the reality. Marco Polo did not invent an entire world. The places he describes existed. The systems he talks about were real. The empire of Kublai Khan was powerful, organized, and far more advanced in certain ways than anything Europe had at the time. That part is not in doubt. But the way Marco presents himself inside that world, that's where things become flexible. His role feels larger. His presence feels more central. His experiences feel slightly too complete. Like a story that has been edited just enough to make the main character stand in the perfect position at the perfect time. And honestly, that's probably exactly what happened. Not a complete fabrication, not a perfect record, but a story shaped by memory, refined by repetition, and enhanced by a storyteller who understood one simple truth. People don't remember accuracy, they remember impact. And Marco Polo delivered impact. He gave Europe a vision of the East that was vivid, structured, and just believable enough to stick. He made distant lands feel real. He made impossible journeys feel achievable, and whether every detail was accurate or not, that effect was undeniable. So no, he didn't lie about everything. But he didn't tell everything exactly as it happened either. He told the version that worked, the version that people would listen to, the version that would survive. And centuries later, here we are, still talking about him, still questioning him, still trying to separate the truth from the story, which, if you think about it, might be the most impressive part of all. Because in the end, Marco Polo didn't just travel across the world, he made sure the world would never stop talking about it. And that might be the greatest story he ever told. In the ancient world, where dust storms swallowed cities and rivers decided the fate of empires, there was said to exist a place so improbable, it almost feels like a joke history decided to tell itself. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a paradise rising out of the desert, dripping with greenery, shaded by trees, and cooled by flowing water in a land where survival alone was considered a luxury. According to ancient writers, these gardens were not simply planted on the ground like any reasonable garden. No, that would be far too practical. Instead, they were stacked in massive terraces, rising layer upon layer, like a green mountain carved by human hands. Vines spilled over stone walls. Palm trees swayed above the city. Exotic plants, imported from distant lands, thrived where they absolutely should not have. And right away you should be suspicious, because everything about this description sounds less like a construction project, and more like someone trying to impress their dinner guests. The story most often told is almost poetic. A powerful king, usually identified as Nebuchadnezzar, built the gardens for his homesick wife, a woman who missed the green hills of her homeland. So naturally, instead of, say, taking her on vacation or sending postcards, he decided to recreate an entire mountain ecosystem in the middle of Mesopotamia. Romantic? Absolutely. Practical? Not even slightly. And yet, ancient historians like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus described the gardens in vivid detail. Stone terraces, hidden irrigation systems, and water being lifted from the Euphrates River to nourish this artificial paradise. There's just one small problem. No one has ever found them. No ruins. No clear references from Babylonian records. Nothing that definitively proves they were ever there. For something considered one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens have left behind an almost suspicious absence of evidence, which raises an uncomfortable question. Were they real? Or were they simply a story repeated so many times that it became history? Because sometimes the most powerful monuments are not built from stone, but from imagination. If the Hanging Gardens were as spectacular as ancient writers claimed, you would expect one thing above all else: clear, consistent evidence, detailed records, local inscriptions, maybe even a proud Babylonian king casually mentioning, "Yes, I built a literal jungle in the desert. You're welcome." Instead, we get silence, and not just any silence, the kind of silence that makes historians deeply uncomfortable. The descriptions of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon come almost entirely from outsiders. Greek and Roman writers like Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and Philo of Byzantium painted vivid pictures of cascading terraces, ingenious irrigation, and impossible greenery. There's just one issue: none of them had actually seen the gardens. Most of these accounts were written centuries after the supposed construction of the gardens. They relied on second-hand stories, traveller tales, and, let's be honest, probably a fair amount of embellishment. Ancient writers were not exactly known for strict fact-checking. If a story sounded impressive enough, it often made the cut. Meanwhile, the people who should have mentioned the gardens didn't. The Babylonians themselves, masters of record-keeping, left behind thousands of clay tablets documenting everything from trade deals to astronomical observations. Yet in all of this, there is no clear, direct reference to the Hanging Gardens. No royal inscription from Nebuchadnezzar boasting about his greatest architectural achievement. No administrative texts describing the maintenance of such a massive project. Nothing. And that's not a small detail you forget to write down. This is the same civilization that carefully recorded the construction of walls, temples, and canals. If they had built one of the most complex and awe-inspiring structures in the ancient world, you would expect at least one tablet saying, "Reminder, water the giant elevated forest." Instead, the only voices describing the gardens come from far away and long after the fact, which leads to an unsettling possibility. What if the Hanging Gardens weren't a Babylonian creation at all? What if the story was misunderstood, misplaced, or even entirely invented by later writers trying to make sense of fragments of older traditions? Because when you strip away the poetic descriptions and the romantic legends, what you're left with is not a clear historical record, but a puzzle made of second-hand stories, missing evidence, and just enough detail to keep us wondering. When history becomes uncertain, storytelling tends to step in and clean things up. And in the case of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the explanation offered is almost suspiciously perfect. A powerful king builds a paradise for his homesick queen. Simple, emotional, memorable. According to tradition, the gardens were commissioned by Nebuchadnezzar II, one of Babylon's most ambitious rulers. His wife, often identified as Amytis, was said to come from a mountainous region, where green hills and forests stretched across the horizon. Babylon, by contrast, was flat, dry, and about as lush as a sun-baked brick. So naturally, the king decided to fix that by building an artificial mountain. Because when your spouse misses home, the obvious solution is to recreate an entire ecosystem. The story is undeniably appealing. It humanizes a powerful ruler. It transforms a massive engineering project into a romantic gesture. It gives the gardens a purpose that goes beyond wealth or display. It makes them personal. And that's exactly why historians are cautious. Because the more perfect a story sounds, the more likely it has been polished over time. There is no solid Babylonian record confirming that this queen ever requested such a garden. No inscription where the king proudly declares his love through irrigation systems and imported trees. In fact, much like the gardens themselves, the romantic narrative exists mainly in later accounts, retold, reshaped, and possibly exaggerated with each passing generation. It fits too well. Ancient writers loved stories that explained grand structures through human emotion. A temple wasn't just built, it was built for a god's favor. A monument wasn't just raised, it was raised out of grief or love. These narratives made complex achievements easier to understand, and more importantly, easier to remember. So the idea of a king building the Hanging Gardens of Babylon for his wife may tell us less about Babylon, and more about how later cultures wanted to interpret it. Because if you remove the romance, what remains is far less poetic. A massive, resource-heavy construction project in a desert environment, requiring constant water, labour, and maintenance. Not exactly the kind of thing you build purely out of affection, unless your version of love includes logistical nightmares. And yet the story persists, because even when the facts are uncertain, people tend to hold on to the version that feels true. A king, a queen, a garden that should not exist. It's a beautiful explanation, which is precisely why we have to question it. Even if we momentarily accept that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were real, another problem immediately rises. How, exactly, did they work? Because building a garden is easy, keeping one alive in the middle of Mesopotamia is not. Babylon sat in a region defined by heat, dust, and long dry seasons. The sun was relentless, the soil was unforgiving, and water, despite the presence of the Euphrates River, was not something you could casually carry uphill in large quantities. And that's where the descriptions of the gardens become almost suspiciously ambitious. Ancient writers claimed the gardens were built in towering terraces, each layer supported by massive stone columns and thick platforms packed with soil deep enough to sustain trees, not small plants. Actual trees with roots, weight, and the audacity to exist far above ground level, which raises a very practical question. How do you stop all of that from collapsing? To support such weight, the structure would have needed advanced engineering, waterproofing systems to prevent rot, reinforced foundations to carry tons of soil, and careful planning to distribute pressure evenly. Some accounts even describe layers of bitumen and lead used to keep water from seeping through the terraces. In other words, this wasn't just a garden. It was an early experiment in vertical architecture. But the real challenge wasn't holding the garden up. It was keeping it alive. The biggest mystery surrounding the Hanging Gardens of Babylon is water. Lots of it, constantly moving upward. Day after day, ancient descriptions suggest some kind of mechanical system, possibly a chain pump or an early screw-like device, lifting water from the river to the top terraces. From there, gravity would do the rest, allowing water to flow down through the layers, feeding plants along the way. It sounds impressive. It also sounds exhausting, because such a system would require continuous labor, maintenance, and precision. One failure, one broken mechanism, and your lush paradise quickly turns into a very expensive pile of dead plants. And yet, despite all these challenges, the accounts insist it worked. That somehow, in one of the harshest environments of the ancient world, a green, living mountain stood tall. Which leaves us with two possibilities. Either the engineers of Babylon achieved something so advanced that it left almost no trace behind, or the story has grown far beyond what was ever physically possible. By now the pattern is hard to ignore. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are described in detail, yet nowhere to be found. The engineering sounds impressive, yet almost too ambitious. The story feels complete, yet strangely unsupported. So historians began asking a different question. What if we've been looking in the wrong place this entire time? Instead of assuming the gardens were in Babylon, some researchers turned their attention north, toward the powerful Assyrian capital of Nineveh, a city known not only for its size and wealth, but for its advanced engineering and, importantly, its obsession with water systems. At the center of this theory stands Sennacherib, a ruler who was not exactly modest about his achievements. Unlike the silence in Babylon, Sennacherib left behind detailed inscriptions describing his construction projects, including what he proudly called a palace without rival. And within those descriptions, something interesting appears. He writes about lush gardens, filled with exotic plants, irrigated by an advanced system that brought water from distant mountains into the city, not carried by hand, not guessed at, built deliberately, with canals, aqueducts, and mechanical devices designed to move water across long distances and up to elevated areas. In other words, exactly the kind of system the Hanging Gardens would have required. Even more intriguing, Sennacherib describes raising water to higher ground, using technology that sounds remarkably similar to what later writers attributed to Babylon. Some scholars believe he may have even developed an early version of the screw pump, centuries before it was commonly credited elsewhere. And unlike the mysterious gardens of Babylon, we actually have evidence of these systems. Archaeological remains of canals and waterworks have been found around Nineveh, showing just how advanced Assyrian engineering had become. Massive stone channels, carefully designed to control and direct water, still exist. Silent proof that someone, at some point, was serious about turning dry land into something greener. So now the story begins to shift. What if the Hanging Gardens were real, just not in Babylon? What if Greek and Roman writers, hearing stories of a magnificent garden in the east, simply attached it to the more famous name? After all, Babylon carried weight. It was legendary. Saying Babylon made the story bigger, more impressive, more believable. And just like that, a garden in Nineveh could become a wonder in Babylon, not through deception, but through the slow drift of storytelling over time. Because history doesn't always lose things completely, sometimes it just moves them. If the Hanging Gardens of Babylon truly existed, whether in Babylon or somewhere else, you would expect one final undeniable confirmation. Ruins, stone foundations, structural remains. even fragments of irrigation systems buried beneath centuries of dust. After all, other wonders of the ancient world left traces behind. They may be broken, weathered, or incomplete, but they are there. The gardens, however, remain stubbornly absent. Excavations in Babylon, particularly those led by Robert Coldaway in the early 20th century, uncovered massive walls, temples, and palaces. The scale of the city was undeniable. This was a place capable of monumental construction, and for a moment it seemed like the mystery might be solved. Coldaway identified a series of vaulted structures, thick walls, deep foundations, and nearby wells that he believed could have supported the terraces of the gardens. It looked promising. The layout suggested strength. The proximity to water hinted at irrigation, but the more closely it was examined, the less convincing it became. Those structures were eventually understood to be part of a storage or administrative complex. Useful, yes, but not exactly the kind of place where you would grow palm trees several stories high. There was no clear evidence of soil layers, no botanical remains, no signs of the extensive waterproofing that such a project would have required. In short, it didn't match the legend. And that pattern keeps repeating. Despite decades of excavation, no definitive trace of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon has been found in Babylon. Not partially, not indirectly, just not at all, which leaves historians in an uncomfortable position. Because it's one thing for a structure to be damaged or eroded over time, it's another for something so large, so complex, and so frequently described to leave behind virtually nothing. Meanwhile, sites like Nineveh continue to offer physical evidence of advanced water systems, channels, aqueducts, and engineering solutions that align far more closely with what the gardens would have required. So the silence in Babylon becomes louder, not just an absence of evidence, but a presence of doubt. And the more we dig, the more the mystery deepens. Because at some point, you have to ask a question that historians don't always like to admit out loud. If something leaves no trace, was it ever really there? Or have we been chasing the shadow of a garden that existed only in the imagination of those who described it? At this point, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon exist in a strange place. Somewhere between history and imagination. Not fully proven, not fully dismissed. Suspended, much like the gardens themselves were said to be. And that might be the most important clue of all. Because the ancient world did not separate fact and storytelling the way we try to today. A story didn't need to be perfectly accurate to be accepted. It just needed to feel true. If it captured power, beauty, or wonder, it survived. And the Hanging Gardens had all three. Greek writers, fascinated by the East, often described distant lands in ways that blended observation with imagination. Cities grew larger in their telling. Palaces became more extravagant. And when something couldn't be easily explained, it was elevated into something extraordinary. A garden in a dry land? That's impressive. A garden rising in terraces, defying nature itself. That's unforgettable. Over time, repetition did the rest. One writer builds on another. Details are added, refined, sometimes exaggerated. What begins as a possibility slowly hardens into a widely accepted fact. Not because it was proven, but because it was told often enough and well enough. And the 7 wonders of the ancient world played a major role in this transformation. The list wasn't created as a strict archaeological record. It was more like a collection of must-see marvels. A kind of ancient travel guide for the curious and the ambitious. Inclusion wasn't based on surviving evidence, but on reputation, scale, and the ability to inspire awe. The Hanging Gardens fit perfectly. Even if no one could point to them with certainty, the idea of them was too powerful to ignore. A green paradise in the desert wasn't just an engineering feat. It was a symbol of control over nature, of wealth beyond imagination, of a world where kings could bend the environment itself to their will. And once that idea took hold, it didn't matter whether the gardens were real in a physical sense. They became real in the cultural sense. They appeared in texts, in teachings, in the shared understanding of what the ancient world had achieved. Generations grew up believing in them, repeating the story, passing it forward without questioning the foundation beneath it. Because sometimes, belief is stronger than evidence. And sometimes, a story doesn't need stone foundations to stand. It just needs to be remembered. By now, you would think the story of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon would have quietly faded away, filed under interesting mistakes, and replaced with more reliable discoveries. But it hasn't. In fact, it has done the exact opposite. The gardens have become more famous over time, not less. They appear in books, documentaries, artwork, and conversations about the ancient world as if their existence were never in doubt. A structure with no confirmed location has somehow achieved a level of certainty that even well-documented monuments struggle to maintain. And that says something important, because the power of the Hanging Gardens does not come from what we can prove. It comes from what we can imagine. A city of baked brick and heat suddenly interrupted by flowing water and shade, terraces layered with life, rising above the desert like a defiance of nature itself. It's not just visually striking, it's emotionally satisfying. It represents control, beauty, and the idea that even the harshest environments can be transformed. That idea is hard to let go of, which is why the gardens continue to live, not in ruins, but in reconstructions. Artists recreate them, historians debate them, writers describe them as if they had walked through them personally, despite the fact that no one ever has. And each time the story is retold, it gains another layer of detail. More plants, more water, more complexity. Because when something cannot be checked against reality, it becomes free to grow. Ironically, the lack of evidence has made the gardens more flexible, more adaptable to imagination. Unlike real structures, which are limited by what remains, the Hanging Gardens can be reshaped endlessly. They can be grander, taller, more vibrant, whatever the storyteller needs them to be. Even modern audiences, surrounded by technology and information, still find themselves drawn to the mystery, not because they expect a final answer, but because the uncertainty itself is part of the appeal. We don't just want to know if the gardens existed, we want to believe they could have. Because if something like that was possible, if an entire landscape could be lifted into the air and sustained against all odds, then the ancient world becomes far more impressive than we imagined. And maybe that's why the story refuses to disappear. Not because it's proven, but because it's too compelling to let go. In the end, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon leave us with something far more unusual than a ruin. They leave us with a question that refuses to settle. Were they real? After everything, the missing evidence, the conflicting accounts, the alternative theories pointing toward places like Nineveh, the honest answer is unsatisfying. We don't know, and that uncertainty is not a weakness of the story. It's the reason it has survived. Most ancient structures follow a predictable path. They are built, admired, damaged, rediscovered, and eventually understood. Their mystery fades as knowledge replaces speculation. But the Hanging Gardens never followed that path. They skipped straight past proof and settled into something more permanent. Imagination. They exist in a space where history and myth overlap, where facts are just solid enough to anchor the story, but not strong enough to define it. And that makes them different from every other wonder, because while others are measured in stone, the gardens are measured in possibility. A place that may never have stood, yet continues to grow in the minds of those who hear about it. A structure with no confirmed foundation, yet somehow more enduring than many that physically existed. There is something almost fitting about that. A garden, after all, is a living thing. It changes, adapts, evolves. It cannot be frozen in a single moment. And in a strange way, the Hanging Gardens have done exactly that, shifting through time, reshaped by every generation that imagines them. Perhaps they were real once, standing briefly before disappearing without a trace. Perhaps they were somewhere else entirely, their identity lost in translation. Or perhaps they never existed at all, beyond the words of those who described them. But in the end, that may not matter as much as we think. Because the true legacy of the Hanging Gardens is not whether they stood in Babylon or anywhere else. It's that they still stand, quietly, invisibly, in the space between what we know and what we believe. And sometimes, that is where the most powerful wonders are found. Before he became a legend carved into the memory of continents, Alexander the Great was simply a young ruler standing at the edge of expectation and deciding it wasn't nearly enough. He came to power at just 20, after the sudden assassination of his father, Philip II of Macedon. The kingdom he inherited was strong but fragile. Enemies waited at the borders. Greek city-states watched closely, ready to rebel the moment they sensed weakness. Most new kings in this position would have moved carefully, securing alliances, stabilizing power, and avoiding unnecessary risks. Alexander did the opposite. He crushed rebellions with shocking speed, sending a clear message that his rule would not be questioned. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Those that submitted were spared. It was not diplomacy, it was calculation. Within a short time, Greece was no longer a concern behind him, and that's when his real ambition revealed itself. Instead of consolidating his kingdom, he looked east, toward the vast and seemingly unstoppable Achaemenid Empire, ruled by Darius III. This was not just another rival kingdom, it was the dominant power of the ancient world, stretching across multiple regions, rich in resources, and supported by massive armies. For most leaders, challenging it would have been unthinkable. For Alexander, it was inevitable. His mindset had been shaped long before he wore a crown. Educated by Aristotle, he had been taught not just how to think, but how to see himself as someone destined for greatness. He admired heroes of epic tradition, especially Achilles, and believed that a short life filled with glory was better than a long one forgotten. That belief changes how a man makes decisions. Alexander did not see limits, only opportunities to test how far he could go. The idea of crossing into Asia and attacking the Persian Empire was not reckless in his mind. It was necessary. Because to him, ruling Macedon was not the goal. It was just the beginning. And so, at an age when most rulers are still learning how to hold power, Alexander prepared to challenge an empire that had dominated the world for generations, convinced that he would not only defeat it, but replace it. Once his power in Greece was secured, Alexander the Great turned his attention east, and unlike many rulers who hesitate before stepping into the unknown, he moved with unsettling confidence. He gathered his army, not a massive force by imperial standards, but one that was disciplined, loyal, and hardened by years of warfare under his father, Philip II of Macedon. These were not just soldiers, they were professionals. They trusted their king, and more importantly, they believed in him. Still, what he was about to do bordered on absurd. He would cross into Asia and attack the Achaemenid Empire, a superpower that dwarfed his own kingdom in size, wealth, and manpower. On paper, this was not a fair fight, but Alexander was not interested in fairness. The crossing of the Hellespont marked more than just a geographical shift. It was symbolic. As he stepped onto Asian soil, he was not simply beginning a campaign. He was entering the territory of legends, following in the imagined footsteps of heroes he had grown up admiring, and he made sure everyone knew it. According to later accounts, he visited the site associated with ancient Troy, honoring the memory of Achilles. It was a calculated gesture. He wasn't just a king leading an army. He was presenting himself as part of a larger story, one that connected myth and reality. Then came the first real test. At the Battle of the Granicus, Persian forces met him near a river, confident that they could crush this young invader before he became a serious threat. They had numbers, terrain, and experience on their side. Alexander had speed and a willingness to take risks that bordered on reckless. Instead of waiting or negotiating, he led a direct assault across the river, attacking uphill against a prepared enemy. It was the kind of decision that could have ended everything before it truly began. But it didn't. His forces broke through. The Persian defenses collapsed. And just like that, the first major obstacle was gone. It was more than a victory. It was proof. Proof that the Persian Empire could be challenged. Proof that this campaign was not a desperate gamble, but something far more dangerous. Because now, Alexander and his army knew something they couldn't unknow. They could win. After the victory at the Granicus, Alexander the Great did not slow down. And that was the real danger. Because one victory can be dismissed as luck, two begins to look like a pattern. As he pushed deeper into Asia Minor, city after city fell into his path. Some resisted and were crushed. Others surrendered, calculating that survival was better than loyalty to a distant king. With each step, Alexander wasn't just expanding territory. He was dismantling the outer defences of the Achaemenid Empire, piece by piece. But the empire was beginning to respond. At the Battle of Issus, Alexander finally faced Darius III himself. This was no longer a regional engagement. This was the empire fighting back, led by its ruler, with a force that vastly outnumbered the Macedonian army. On open ground, the outcome would have been predictable, but Issus was not open ground. The battlefield was narrow, squeezed between mountains and sea, limiting the advantage of Persian numbers. It was the kind of terrain that turned a massive army into a crowded one, and Alexander took full advantage of it. While Darius commanded from a distance, Alexander did the opposite. He charged. Leading from the front, he drove directly toward the Persian center, aiming not just to win the battle, but to break the man holding the empire together. It was a strategy built on a simple understanding. If the king falls, everything else begins to collapse. And that's exactly what happened. Under pressure, Darius lost control of the situation. His lines faltered. Then, in a moment that would echo across history, he fled the battlefield, abandoning not only his army, but his own family, who were captured by Alexander shortly after. It was more than a military defeat. It was psychological. The image of the Persian king retreating while the young Macedonian king advanced shattered the illusion of invincibility that had surrounded the empire for generations. Suddenly, the balance of power didn't just shift, it cracked. And Alexander understood what that meant. He wasn't just winning battles anymore. He was unraveling an empire from the inside out. With the Persian king in retreat and the western half of the Achaemenid Empire collapsing behind him, Alexander the Great pushed deeper into the heart of the empire, toward a city that was more than just a capital. It was a symbol. Persepolis was not the administrative center of Persia, but it didn't need to be. It was where power was displayed, where kings celebrated their dominance, where tribute from across the empire was gathered and presented. Its grand halls, towering columns, and intricate reliefs were designed to send a message. This empire was eternal. Alexander intended to prove otherwise. When he entered the city, he did not find resistance. He found wealth, vast amounts of it. Treasures accumulated over generations, stored in palaces that reflected the scale of Persian power. For his army, it was a reward beyond imagination. But for Alexander, it was something else, a statement waiting to be made. At some point during his stay, whether driven by calculation, anger, or something more impulsive, the decision was made to burn Persepolis. Flames spread through the palace complex, consuming one of the most iconic symbols of Persian rule. Ancient sources offer different explanations. Some claim it was deliberate revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. Others suggest it was a drunken decision, encouraged by those around him in a moment of celebration. Either way, the result was the same. Fire turned stone into smoke. The destruction of Persepolis was not just physical, it was symbolic. It marked the collapse of an empire's identity, the visible end of something that had once seemed unbreakable. But there's an irony here, because not long after the flames died, Alexander appeared to regret the decision. The same man who had destroyed the city would later begin adopting elements of Persian culture, presenting himself not just as a conqueror, but as a successor to the very empire he had shattered, which makes the burning of Persepolis feel less like a clear strategy and more like a turning point. A moment where conquest crossed into something more complicated, because destroying an empire is one thing, replacing it is another, and Alexander was beginning to realize that ruling what he had conquered would require more than fire. After the flames of Persepolis faded into ash, the war was not over, because the Achaemenid Empire still had a king, and as long as Darius III remained alive, the empire, at least in theory, still existed. So Alexander the Great did something that reveals a lot about how he saw power. He didn't stop to consolidate. He chased, eastward, deeper into unfamiliar territory, across vast distances that stretched the limits of his army. This was no longer a campaign of decisive battles. It became a pursuit, a relentless movement across deserts, mountains, and regions that were far less welcoming than the cities he had already taken. Because this was no longer just about territory, it was about legitimacy. If Alexander could capture Darius, he wouldn't just be a conqueror. He would be the undisputed ruler of the Persian world. The man who didn't just defeat an empire but inherited it. But Darius was always just out of reach. Retreating further east, relying on loyalty that was beginning to crack, he tried to regroup, to rebuild, to maintain the illusion that he was still in control. But the longer he fled, the weaker that illusion became. Eventually, the pursuit ended. Not with a battle, but with betrayal. Darius was captured and killed by one of his own satraps, a man trying to position himself for power in the chaos. When Alexander finally reached him, the Persian king was already dead, left abandoned, his empire effectively leaderless. And in that moment, something shifted. Alexander did not celebrate. Instead, he reacted with something closer to anger. He ordered that Darius be given a royal burial, honoring him as a king, and the man responsible for his death was hunted down and executed. On the surface, it looks like respect, but it was also something else, a message. By honoring Darius, Alexander wasn't just showing mercy, he was stepping into his place, positioning himself not as a foreign invader, but as the rightful successor to the Achaemenid Empire. The chase had ended, but the conquest had changed, because now Alexander was no longer just destroying an empire, he was becoming it. With Darius III dead and the Achaemenid Empire effectively leaderless, Alexander the Great stood at a strange crossroads. He had done what few thought possible. He had broken the empire. Now he had to decide what to do with it. And instead of ruling it as an outsider, he made a choice that confused, frustrated, and even angered many of his own men. He began to adopt it. Alexander started incorporating Persian customs into his court. He wore elements of Persian dress. He introduced ceremonies and rituals that were foreign and uncomfortable to his Macedonian companions. He began surrounding himself not just with Greek and Macedonian elites, but with Persian nobles, integrating them into positions of power. To him, this was practical. To his army, it looked like betrayal. They had followed him across continents, fought impossible battles, and watched him dismantle the empire piece by piece. And now, instead of celebrating their dominance, their king seemed to be blending with the very culture they had defeated. But Alexander wasn't thinking like a conqueror anymore. He was thinking like a ruler of something much larger. The Persian Empire had survived for so long, not just because of military strength, but because it knew how to govern diverse populations. It allowed local traditions to continue. It adapted. It absorbed. Alexander saw the value in that. If he tried to impose purely Macedonian rule across such a vast territory, it would fracture. Resistance would grow. Control would weaken. But if he positioned himself as the natural successor, respecting Persian traditions while maintaining his authority, he could hold it together, at least in theory. One of the most controversial moments came with the introduction of proskynesis, a Persian gesture of respect that involved bowing or even kneeling before the king. To Persians, this was normal. To Macedonians, it felt like something reserved for gods, not men. And Alexander expected them to do it. That didn't go well. Tension grew within his ranks. Some saw him as evolving. Others saw him as losing himself. The line between king and god, between leader and ruler of an empire, was becoming blurred. And the deeper he moved into the east, the more that line seemed to disappear. Because Alexander was no longer just conquering lands. He was reshaping identity, his own, and that of the empire he now ruled. By the time Alexander the Great had secured the core of the Achaemenid Empire, most rulers would have stopped. He didn't, because for Alexander, there was always something beyond the horizon. Another land, another challenge, another edge of the world waiting to be reached. So he kept moving east, through harsh terrain, across unfamiliar cultures, and into regions that had never seen a Macedonian army. His campaign turned from conquest into endurance. The battles were no longer just against organized empires, but against distance, climate, and exhaustion. And still, he pressed forward. Eventually, this relentless advance brought him to the Indian subcontinent, where he would face one of his most formidable opponents at the Battle of the Hydaspes. There, he encountered King Porus, a ruler who did something rare when facing Alexander. He stood his ground. Unlike previous enemies who had been broken or scattered, Porus met him with a disciplined force and something Alexander had not yet faced in battle. War elephants. Massive, unpredictable, and terrifying. They added a new level of chaos to the battlefield. For the first time, victory was not guaranteed. The battle was long, brutal, and uncertain. Rain-soaked terrain slowed movement. The elephants disrupted formations. Both sides took heavy losses, But once again Alexander adapted. His forces maneuvered, outflanked, and eventually broke through. In the end, Porus was defeated, but what happened next revealed how much Alexander had changed. Instead of executing or humiliating him, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied simply, as a king, and Alexander agreed. He allowed Porus to retain his rule, effectively turning an enemy into an ally. It was no longer just about domination. It was about control through respect, through integration, through understanding how to govern rather than just conquer. But even as he won, something was beginning to crack. His army, tired, far from home and increasingly uncertain, had reached its limit. They had followed him across continents, through endless campaigns, chasing a vision that seemed to expand with every victory. And now, standing at what felt like the end of the world, they refused to go further. For the first time, Alexander could not move forward, not because of an enemy, but because his own army had decided it was enough. For the first time since the campaign began, Alexander the Great faced something he could not defeat. Not an army, not a king, his own men. After years of marching, fighting, and pushing beyond every known boundary, his army refused to go any further east. They had reached the edge of their endurance, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The promise of endless conquest no longer inspired them. It exhausted them, Alexander argued, pleaded, and tried to reignite their ambition. But the answer remained the same. No, and so, reluctantly, he turned back. But the return journey would prove to be just as brutal as the conquest itself. Instead of retracing a safer route, Alexander chose a path through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest environments his army had ever faced. It was a decision that still raises questions, whether it was meant to prove a point, test his men, or simply assert control one last time. Whatever the reason, the result was devastating. Heat, thirst, and exhaustion began to take their toll almost immediately. Supplies ran out, water became scarce, soldiers collapsed under the relentless sun, animals died, equipment was abandoned. What had once been a disciplined, unstoppable force slowly turned into a struggling column of survivors. And yet Alexander endured it with them. He refused special treatment, sharing in the same conditions as his soldiers. At one point, when offered water that could have saved him, he reportedly poured it onto the ground rather than drink while his men went without. It was a powerful gesture, but it didn't change the reality. The return was no longer a triumph, it was survival. By the time they emerged from the desert, the army that had crossed into Asia years earlier was no longer the same. It had been reduced, hardened, and transformed by everything it had endured, and so had Alexander. Because somewhere along the way, the line between ambition and obsession had begun to blur. The drive that once led him to impossible victories had also led him into decisions that cost thousands of lives. He had conquered an empire, but the journey back revealed the cost of pushing too far for too long. And for the first time, the question was no longer how much more he could take, but how much more he could hold together. By the time Alexander the Great returned to the heart of his empire, he had achieved something almost impossible. He had destroyed the Achaemenid Empire, burned its symbols, chased down its king, and then, just as unexpectedly, rebuilt it in his own image. Greek and Persian cultures were no longer separate worlds. They had been forced together, blended through conquest, marriage, and administration. On the surface, it looked like success, but underneath, cracks were already forming. Alexander began planning even more campaigns, toward Arabia, perhaps even beyond. His ambition had not slowed. If anything, it had grown. The idea of stopping, of stabilizing, of simply ruling what he had already taken, never seemed to fully take hold. And then suddenly everything stopped anyway. In the city of Babylon, the same place where so many empires had risen and fallen, Alexander fell ill. The details are unclear. Fever, exhaustion, possible disease. But the outcome was undeniable. At just 32, he died, and with him, the future of his empire became uncertain almost instantly, because Alexander had done something extraordinary, but also something dangerously incomplete. He had built an empire that depended entirely on him. There was no clear successor, no stable system to ensure continuity, no agreement among his generals about who should take control. The unity he had forced into existence through sheer will began to unravel the moment that will disappeared. His generals, Men who had fought beside him for years turned against each other. Alliances shifted. Territories were divided. What had once been a single vast empire fractured into competing kingdoms, each claiming a piece of his legacy. The dream did not survive him, but something else did. The cultural blending he had initiated, the mixing of Greek and Persian traditions, continued to shape the regions he had conquered. Cities he founded remained centers of influence. Ideas, art, and customs moved across boundaries that had once been rigid. So in the end, Alexander did not leave behind a lasting empire. He left behind a transformation, a world that had been forced into contact, into exchange, into something new. And maybe that was always the real conquest. Not just land, but the reshaping of entire civilizations, long after the man who started it was gone. Long before wine was poured into fine cups or spirits were distilled into something dangerously strong, there was a drink that quietly shaped entire civilizations. Beer, not the kind you're imagining. This early beer, especially in places like Sumer, was thick, cloudy, and often filled with bits of grain floating around like they had no intention of leaving. People didn't sip it delicately. They drank it through straws to avoid chewing their beverage. It was less a drink, and more a survival strategy that happened to be mildly enjoyable. And survival is exactly what it was. In the ancient world, clean drinking water was not guaranteed. Rivers carried bacteria. Wells could be contaminated. But fermentation changed everything. The brewing process made liquids safer, more stable, and far less likely to make you regret your life choices immediately after drinking them. So beer became essential. Not optional, not occasional, daily. It was consumed by men, women, and even children in diluted forms. It provided calories, hydration, and a sense of normality in a world where food security was never certain. In many ways, beer was not just part of the diet. It was the diet. And once something becomes that important, it doesn't stay confined to the kitchen. It spreads into everything. Beer became a form of payment. Labourers were often compensated in rations of it, turning brewing into an economic system as much as a culinary one. It flowed through temples, households, and marketplaces, connecting different layers of society through a shared dependence on fermentation. And then, as ancient societies tended to do, they gave it a god. The Sumerians worshipped Ninkasi, the divine protector of brewing. There was even a hymn dedicated to her, one that doubled as a step-by-step brewing guide. So if you wanted to make beer, you could follow a sacred song and hope the goddess approved of your technique, which, in fairness, is still less stressful than modern recipes that assume you already know what you're doing. The existence of Ninkasi tells you something important. Beer was not just a drink. It was sacred, practical, and deeply embedded in daily life, all at once. And once a civilization builds itself around something so fundamental, it doesn't just consume it, it evolves it. Because what began as a basic necessity was about to become something much bigger. Something that would shape rituals, economies, and entire cultures across the ancient world. Once beer became essential to daily life in Sumer, it didn't remain just a practical solution to unsafe water. It became something far more powerful. It became sacred. Because when a substance feeds your people, sustains your workers, and appears in nearly every part of life, it doesn't stay ordinary for long. It enters religion. It becomes ritual. It transforms into something that connects humans to the divine. And in Sumer, that connection had a name: Ninkasi. Brewing was not seen as a simple domestic task. It was guided, protected, and in a sense overseen by a goddess. The famous hymn to Ninkasi was more than just a prayer. It was a brewing process disguised as devotion. Step by step, it described how grain was prepared, baked into bread, and then fermented into beer. So every time someone brewed, they weren't just making a drink. They were repeating a sacred act. And that changes how people approach something. Brewing required care, patience, and knowledge. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't ignore the process. If something went wrong, it wasn't just a failed batch. It could be seen as a failure to respect the divine order behind it, which is probably one of the earliest examples of people blaming a higher power for a bad outcome. But beyond humour, this belief gave brewing structure. Temples played a major role in production. Beer was not only made in homes, It was produced in large quantities in religious centres, where it was distributed as offerings, rations, and part of ceremonial life. It was poured out to honour the gods. It was consumed during festivals. It was part of the rhythm of worship itself. In other words, beer wasn't just present in religion, it was integrated into it. And that integration had consequences, because once something becomes sacred, it gains stability. Traditions form. Recipes are preserved. Techniques are passed down with care. Brewing wasn't reinvented every generation. It was refined, protected, and repeated. It became knowledge, and knowledge spreads. As neighbouring cultures interacted with Mesopotamia, through trade, migration, and conflict, the practice of brewing travelled with them. The idea that fermented grain could nourish, sustain, and even connect people to something greater began to take root beyond Sumer. And with each new culture, brewing would change slightly. New ingredients, new methods, new meanings, but the core idea remained the same. Beer was never just a drink. It was something closer to a bridge, between survival and ritual, between the human and the divine. As brewing spread beyond Sumer, it found fertile ground in another civilization that understood the value of turning grain into something far more useful. Ancient Egypt. And in Egypt, beer didn't just survive, it evolved. If Sumerians treated beer as essential, Egyptians made it unavoidable. It became one of the most important parts of daily life, consumed by nearly everyone, from labourers to elites. Like bread, it was a staple, so common that the two were often produced together. In fact, Egyptian beer was sometimes described as liquid bread, which sounds poetic, until you realise it was also quite literal. The brewing process often began with baking loaves of partially cooked bread made from barley or emmer wheat. These loaves were then crumbled into water and left to ferment. What resulted was a thick, nutrient-rich drink, cloudy, slightly sour, and packed with calories. Not exactly refreshing by modern standards, but incredibly effective. Beer provided hydration, energy, and nutrients in a single form. In a hot climate where clean water could still be unreliable, this made it indispensable. Workers building massive projects, including those associated with places like Giza Pyramid Complex, were often paid in beer rations, just as they were in bread. So if you imagine ancient Egyptian labour, you should probably also imagine a steady supply of beer nearby, because without it, the system doesn't really work. But beer in Egypt wasn't just for survival or labour, it had a spiritual role as well. Offerings of beer were made to the gods, placed in tombs, and included in rituals connected to the afterlife. The idea was simple. If beer sustained you in life, it should sustain you in death as well, which is a level of commitment to a beverage that modern culture can almost respect. Different types of beer existed, varying in strength, flavour and quality. Some were coarse and everyday, others were refined and reserved for higher status individuals. Brewing became both a household activity and an organised industry, with specialised production in larger facilities. And just like in Sumer, this consistency mattered, because once a civilization depends on something this much, it doesn't leave it to chance. It perfects it. Egypt didn't invent beer, but it transformed it into something structured, scaled, and deeply embedded in both life and death. A drink that wasn't just consumed, but relied upon. By the time beer had taken root in both Sumer and ancient Egypt, it was no longer just a necessity or a ritual object. It had become something else entirely. Power. Because when a society depends on a product every single day, something that feeds its people, pays its workers, and supports its religious life, that product becomes more than sustenance. It becomes control. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, brewing was not left entirely in private hands. While households could produce their own beer, large-scale production was often tied to institutions, temples, palaces, and administrative centres. These were not just places of worship or governance, they were economic hubs. Grain was collected, stored, and redistributed. Workers were organised, and beer, along with bread, became a standardised form of payment. Instead of coins or abstract currency, people were compensated with something immediately useful. You worked. You received beer. Simple, effective, and impossible to ignore. This system allowed authorities to maintain a steady workforce. Labourers building infrastructure, maintaining cities, or working in fields didn't need to negotiate wages in a modern sense. Their survival was directly tied to the distribution of essential goods. Goods controlled by those in power. And beer was at the center of it, which meant brewing wasn't just about making a drink. It was about managing a population. If supply remained steady, people were fed, hydrated, and productive. If it faltered, unrest could follow. So brewing became organized, monitored, and in many cases standardized. Measurements, recipes, and distributions were recorded to ensure consistency, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. Trade also began to develop around brewing. Grain moved between regions. Different areas developed their own styles and techniques. What started as a local survival method began to connect wider networks of exchange. And once something enters trade, it gains value beyond its original purpose. Beer could now represent wealth, status, and influence, not just nourishment. It also created specialization. Not everyone brewed anymore. Some individuals and groups focused entirely on production, refining their methods, increasing efficiency, and improving quality. Brewing shifted from a shared household activity into something closer to an organized craft. And with that shift came another layer of importance, because now, controlling beer meant controlling not just survival, but economy. And once something becomes economic power, it rarely stays simple. It grows, spreads, and adapts, just like the civilizations that depended on it. As brewing spread across regions and cultures, it began to change. What started in Sumer as a thick, bread-based drink and evolved in ancient Egypt into a structured staple did not remain the same everywhere. Once beer moved beyond its original environments, it adapted, shaped by climate, crops, and local taste. And this is where brewing becomes more than tradition. It becomes identity. Different regions had access to different grains. Barley remained common, but other cereals began to appear depending on what the land could support. The flavour, texture, and strength of beer started to vary. Some were lighter, others heavier. Some were consumed fresh, while others were allowed to ferment longer, creating stronger effects, which, unsurprisingly, made them more popular. But ingredients weren't the only thing changing. Techniques evolved as well. Fermentation was still not fully understood. People didn't know about yeast in a scientific sense, but they understood patterns. They knew which conditions worked, which didn't, and how to repeat successful results. Brewing became a process guided by observation and experience, refined over generations. And as this knowledge spread, so did experimentation. Herbs, fruits, and other flavouring elements began to be introduced in certain regions. Before hops became common much later, ancient brewers used whatever they had available to adjust taste, preserve the drink, or simply make it more enjoyable. Not all experiments were successful, but enough were to push brewing forward. And with variation came distinction. Beer was no longer a single, uniform product. It became regional, local, recognizable. You could tell where a beer came from based on how it tasted, how it was made, and what it contained. Which meant brewing was no longer just about survival. It was about culture. Drinking habits began to reflect social structures. Some beers were everyday staples. Others were reserved for elites or special occasions. Certain types became associated with rituals, while others remained tied to labour and daily consumption. And just like that, beer started telling stories. Not through words, but through flavour, method, and use. Each variation carried the imprint of the people who made it, their environment, their resources, their preferences. What began as a necessity had now become something far more complex, a reflection of civilization itself. Because once a society starts shaping something to its own identity, that thing stops being universal and becomes personal. As beer became more refined and culturally distinct, it didn't lose its earlier connection to ritual, it deepened it. Because once a drink is tied to survival, economy, and identity, it inevitably finds its way into the most important moments of human life. Celebration. Across ancient societies, from Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt, beer was not just consumed daily. It was elevated during festivals, ceremonies, and communal gatherings. It marked transitions, honoured the gods, and brought people together in ways that few other things could. It became part of shared experience. In Mesopotamia, large feasts often included significant amounts of beer, consumed collectively through long straws from shared vessels. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Drinking together reinforced social bonds, created a sense of unity, and blurred the lines between individuals, at least for a while, which, depending on the strength of the beer, may have been the entire point. In Egypt, beer played a central role in religious festivals, particularly those associated with deities linked to joy, chaos, and renewal. One well-known tradition involved a festival where large quantities of beer were consumed in celebration of Hathor, a goddess connected to love, music, and intoxication. According to myth, beer itself once prevented destruction. The story tells of a time when humanity faced annihilation, only to be saved when a goddess, mistaking dyed beer for blood, drank it, became intoxicated, and abandoned her destructive path. So, in a way, beer didn't just bring people together, it saved them, at least mythologically. But beyond the stories, the role of beer in ritual served a practical function. It created rhythm. Festivals broke the monotony of daily labour. They provided structured moments of release, where strict social roles could relax, even if temporarily. Beer became the medium through which this shift occurred, a controlled form of chaos that allowed societies to reset without collapsing. And that balance mattered, because too much control creates tension, too much chaos creates instability. Beer, strangely enough, sat right in the middle. It allowed people to step outside their routines, connect with each other, and engage with something larger, whether that was community, tradition, or the divine. And as brewing continued to evolve, so did its role in these moments. It was no longer just about drinking. It was about experience, because sometimes what people value most isn't the substance itself, but what it allows them to become. As brewing became more complex and more essential, it began to shift from something everyone did to something only some people did well. And that shift changed everything. In earlier periods, especially in places like Sumer, brewing was often a household activity. Families made their own beer, following traditions passed down through generations. It was part of daily life, no different from preparing food or storing grain. But as demand grew, consistency started to matter, because when beer becomes a form of payment, a religious offering, and a central part of the economy, you can't afford for it to vary wildly from batch to batch. One bad brew isn't just disappointing, it disrupts systems. So brewing began to specialize. Certain individuals, often women in early Mesopotamian societies, became known for their skill in brewing. They understood the process more deeply, knew how to control fermentation better, and could produce reliable results. Over time, this knowledge became valuable enough to separate them from the general population. They weren't just making beer anymore, they were professionals. This transition is even reflected in early laws. The famous Code of Hammurabi includes regulations related to tavern keepers and beer sellers. Prices were controlled, quality was expected, and punishments for cheating or watering down beer could be severe, which tells you something important. Beer was serious business. Taverns began to appear as social and economic spaces, where beer was not just produced, but distributed and consumed in a more organized way. These weren't just places to drink. They were centers of interaction, trade, and communication. Information moved through them. Deals were made in them. Reputations were built or destroyed in them. And behind it all were the brewers, people who had turned a basic survival process into a skilled craft. They controlled not just the product, but the experience surrounding it. As time went on, this specialization continued to grow. Brewing techniques became more refined, equipment improved, knowledge expanded. What had once been a shared necessity slowly transformed into something closer to an industry. And like any industry, it created hierarchy. Some brewers gained recognition, others remained local. Certain styles became associated with quality, while others stayed simple and functional. But the key change had already happened. Beer was no longer just something people made. It was something people mastered. And once a skill reaches that level, it stops being ordinary. It becomes a craft. By the time brewing had become a specialized craft in places like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, it was no longer contained to a single region. It was moving. Trade routes expanded. Empires rose and fell. People migrated, carrying with them not just goods, but knowledge. And brewing, practical, adaptable, and deeply tied to survival, was one of the easiest traditions to transport, because wherever there was grain, there could be beer. As brewing spread into regions like Anatolia, Levant, and eventually into Europe, it began to evolve again. Local environments dictated new approaches. Different grains, climates, and storage methods all influenced how beer was made and consumed. And with each new region, brewing adapted just enough to feel familiar, but different enough to stand on its own. In some areas, beer remained thick and close to its original form. In others, it became lighter, more drinkable, and easier to produce in larger quantities. Fermentation techniques improved slowly, guided not by science, but by repeated experience, and once again, culture shaped the outcome. In early European societies, beer became deeply tied to daily life, much like it had in earlier civilizations. It was consumed regularly, often safer than water, and provided essential calories. But unlike in Mesopotamia, where brewing was often tied to temples, or Egypt, where it was integrated into state systems, in many European communities it remained more localized, more personal. Small-scale brewing became common, with families or villages producing their own variations. Over time, this led to a wide diversity of styles, each shaped by local ingredients and traditions, which meant beer began to tell even more stories, not just about survival or economy, but about place. At the same time, trade ensured that ideas didn't stay isolated. Techniques moved along with merchants. Ingredients were exchanged. Knowledge blended across regions, slowly pushing brewing toward greater complexity. And yet, despite all this change, one thing remained consistent. The purpose. Beer still nourished, still connected people, still played a role in rituals, labor, and daily life. It had changed in form, but not in function. It was still, at its core, a solution. A way for civilizations to manage resources, support populations, and create shared experiences. And by this point, it was no longer tied to one culture or one origin. It had become something universal, a practice that followed humanity wherever it settled, because wherever people built societies, they didn't just build homes and cities, they built ways to brew. By the time brewing had spread across regions, cultures, and continents, something subtle but important had changed. Beer was no longer just a solution to a problem. It had become a legacy. What began in Sumer as a practical response to unsafe water and grew in ancient Egypt into a structured staple of life had now evolved into something far more enduring. It was no longer defined by necessity alone. It was shaped by tradition, memory, and identity. And that kind of transformation tends to last, because once a practice becomes embedded across generations, it stops being something you do for survival. It becomes something you do because it has always been done. Brewing techniques continue to improve slowly, refined through observation and repetition rather than scientific understanding. People didn't know exactly why fermentation worked, but they knew how to make it work. That knowledge was preserved, shared, and protected. Recipes were passed down, methods were repeated, mistakes were remembered. And through that process, brewing became part of cultural continuity. Even as societies changed, even as empires rose and collapsed, the act of brewing remained. It adapted to new conditions, new ingredients, new preferences, but it never disappeared. Because it didn't belong to a single civilization anymore, it belonged to all of them. At the same time, beer retained its layered role. It was still consumed daily, still used in celebrations, still tied to social life. But now it also carried something less tangible: heritage. A drink could represent a place, a method could represent a people, a flavor could represent history itself. And that is where brewing reaches its final transformation, not just as a product, but as a reflection of human behavior, because the story of beer is not really about beer. It's about how humans solve problems, then refine those solutions, and eventually turn them into culture. It's about taking something simple, grain, water, time, and building systems, rituals, economies, and identities around it. And perhaps most importantly, it's about continuity, because long after the first brewers in Sumer stirred their mixtures without fully understanding the process, the result of their actions continued to echo forward, through Egypt, through trade routes, through generations, and into the modern world, not as a forgotten relic, but as something still alive, still evolving, still being poured, shared and shaped by the same instinct that started it all, the instinct to take what we have and turn it into something more.